It is February 1943, and the city of Stalingrad in southwestern Russia has been reduced to ruins. For nearly 6 months, it has been the epicenter of one of the bloodiest battles in human history. Over 2 million soldiers and civilians have been caught in the struggle between the Soviet Red Army and Germany. Stalingrad, located on the banks of the Volga River, had once been an industrial powerhouse, but now it's a frozen wasteland of shattered buildings and snow-covered debris. Lying beneath the ruins of what was once a factory, half buried in snow, is Sergei Novikov, a Soviet infantryman. He has been stationed in Stalingrad since the early days of the battle. Like many others, Sergei has witnessed the city's transformation from a bustling center of life to a desolate battlefield. Over 90% of the buildings have been destroyed by constant shelling and air raids. Now, only the skeletons of these structures remain. Sergei's body is numb from the cold, his breath slow and shallow. It's nearly 40 degrees below freezing. He knows he cannot stay here for long, but right now, moving could be fatal. A German patrol is nearby, their boots crunching in the snow, searching for any Soviet soldiers still hiding among the ruins. The Germans are thorough, the orders are clear: no survivors. The Battle of Stalingrad had started in August 1942, with the German army launching a massive offensive to seize control of the city. It was seen as a key to dominating the Soviet Union and cutting off access to vital resources. The city's strategic location on the Volga River made it a crucial point for the transport of oil, grain, and other supplies. The fight for Stalingrad became a symbol of Soviet resistance, with the Red Army ordered to hold the city at all costs. Sergei, like the rest of the Soviet defenders, has endured relentless German assaults. The Luftwaffe dropped over 1,000 tons of bombs in just the first few days. And since then, the fighting has been brutal and up close, street by street, building by building. Over 1 million Soviet soldiers have been killed, wounded, or captured in this battle alone. As Sergei lies still beneath the snow, the Germans move closer, their flashlights sweeping the ruins. The beam of light passes over him for a brief moment, but he remains motionless. His heart beats heavily in his chest, but he knows that panic will only get him killed. By now, the German 6th Army, once feared for its discipline and strength, has been worn down by the relentless Soviet counteroffensive and the brutal Russian winter. The temperature has dropped to a deadly -40 degrees Celsius, and supplies have been cut off for weeks. Thousands of German soldiers have frozen to death, while others, starving, resorted to eating horses and even rats. Sergei has seen it all, the desperation on both sides. The battle has taken more than just lives. It has stripped away any sense of normalcy. For the men still left in the city, survival is all that matters. The patrol finally moves on, their footsteps fading into the distance. Sergei exhales slowly, releasing the tension that had gripped him. These would be the final days of the war, but for Sergei, the fight to live has only begun.
Sergei Novikov was born in 1919, in a small, forgotten village nestled in the rolling hills near Kursk, a region known for its vast, fertile plains and harsh winters. Wheat, potatoes, and occasionally livestock provided just enough to keep them going. His family, like most in rural Russia, survived on what they could grow. Life was simple, but hard. His father, Ivan, had fought in the Russian Civil War, a man hardened by years of conflict and revolution. Ivan's face, etched with lines of exhaustion and loss, often turned grim when he spoke of those years. The stories he shared with young Sergei were not tales of glory, but of survival, grueling and bitter. He told of hunger that clawed at the stomach, of freezing nights spent in trenches, and of comrades lost to the chaos that engulfed Russia after the revolution. Ivan didn't glorify war. He feared it. But he also believed in duty, in the necessity of defending the motherland. And that sense of duty seeped into Sergei from an early age. Growing up, Sergei spent his days helping his father in the fields. The work was hard, tilling the soil by hand, harvesting crops before the frost set in. It was a life that tested his endurance, but it also gave him strength. He was the eldest of 3 siblings, and after his mother passed away when he was just 10, much of the burden of caring for his younger brother and sister fell to him. His father, though strong, was often away on work assignments, leaving Sergei to run the household. By the time he was a teenager, the world beyond his village was going through change and turmoil. Europe was sliding toward war once again, and tensions were rising. Then, in 1939, Germany invaded Poland. By the winter of 1940, Sergei Novikov, at just 20 years old, was recruited to the Soviet Red Army. At the time, the Soviet Union was not yet facing a direct threat. In fact, just a year earlier, Stalin had signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact with Germany, a non-aggression treaty that had stunned the world. For the Soviet Union, it was an opportunity to expand their borders and avoid attack from warring Germany. Soviet and German soldiers, once bitter enemies, were suddenly allies. For many in the Red Army, including Sergei, the idea of Germany as a temporary friend seemed strange, unsettling even. But there was no questioning orders. Sergei spent the early months of his military career stationed near the western borders of the Soviet Union, guarding territories newly acquired under the treaty. Germany was sweeping through Europe with lightning speed, conquering France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. Stalin watched from Moscow, wary of Germany's growing power, but bound by the treaty. Then, in June of 1941, everything changed. Without warning, the Germans broke the pact and launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion in history. The Germans stormed across the Soviet frontier with 3 million soldiers, tanks, planes, and artillery. The Germans viewed the Soviet Union as a vast territory that would provide Lebensraum, living space, for the German people. His ideology saw Slavic peoples as inferior, and he believed Germany's destiny was to conquer and colonize the lands of Eastern Europe. Additionally, the Germans' deep hatred of communism made the Soviet Union, a communist state, a natural enemy. He wanted to destroy the heart of global communism and secure control over the Soviet Union's vast natural resources, particularly oil and grain, to fuel the German war effort. The Germans also sought to eliminate any potential threat from the Soviet Union and consolidate his control over Europe. Emboldened by the rapid victories in Western Europe, the German generals believed the Soviet Union could be swiftly defeated. Sergei's unit, stationed on the Western Front, was thrown into immediate combat. At first, the Red Army was caught completely off guard. Sergei watched in disbelief as the once ally turned into the deadliest enemy overnight. The Germans moved with terrifying speed, crushing everything in their path. Cities burned, and villages were destroyed. In those first few months, Sergei saw a side of war he hadn't imagined. The chaos of retreat, the fear in the eyes of his fellow soldiers. Entire divisions were wiped out by the advancing German blitzkrieg, as the Soviet Union scrambled to defend itself. Sergei and his comrades fought desperately to slow the German advance, often engaging in brutal close-quarters combat as they defended village after village. It wasn't long before Sergei's skills as a sniper became essential. His sharp eye and steady hand allowed him to strike key German targets from a distance, providing cover for his comrades as they retreated. But despite the Red Army's efforts, the Germans continued to push deeper into Soviet territory. Sergei's unit was forced to retreat again and again, each time moving further east as German tanks rolled closer to the heart of Russia. The landscapes he had once known, small towns, rolling fields, forests, were reduced to ruins in the wake of the German war machine. In the winter of 1941, Sergei fought in the defense of Moscow, where the Red Army finally managed to halt the German advance. The brutal Russian winter and the Soviet Union's vast resources had slowed German momentum, but the cost had been devastating. The Soviet Union had lost millions of men in those early months of the war, and Sergei had lost many of his comrades. But by the summer of 1942, the war had reached a new stage. The Germans had regrouped and now turned their attention to the south, to the industrial heart of the Soviet Union. The Germans' next target was Stalingrad, a city that bore the name of the Soviet leader himself. Capturing Stalingrad would give Germany control of vital resources and strategic routes. Sergei and his unit were reassigned, sent to the front lines of the Eastern Front to defend Stalingrad at all costs. As he approached the city in August of 1942, Sergei knew that this battle would be unlike anything he had faced before. Stalingrad would test every ounce of strength, skill, and resilience he had left, and the outcome would determine not only his fate, but the fate of the entire war. By the summer of 1941, Sergei Novikov had become a seasoned soldier, a sniper known for his precision and patience. The German invasion of the Soviet Union, Operation Barbarossa, had thrown Sergei and his comrades into a war unlike anything they had imagined. The speed of the German advance was overwhelming, and in those early months, the Soviet forces were caught on their heels. Entire cities fell, as the German war machine pushed deeper into Soviet territory, leaving destruction in its wake. Through it all, Sergei remained calm under pressure. The chaos of battle seemed to slow around him when he peered down the sights of his rifle. His marksmanship became a critical asset, especially as the fighting shifted to brutal, close-quarters combat. Sergei and his unit were often tasked with holding defensive positions, picking off German officers and machine gunners from hidden vantage points. It was a job that required nerves of steel, and Sergei's quiet resilience made him the perfect man for it. But as the months passed, the fighting took a toll on Sergei. He had lost friends, men who had been like brothers to him, in the relentless German onslaught. The cold, the exhaustion, the constant bombardments. They wore down even the strongest soldiers. But Sergei kept going, driven by a sense of duty that had been instilled in him since childhood. He wasn't fighting for glory or recognition. He was fighting for survival, and for the family he had left behind. By the summer of '42, the tide of war had shifted. The Soviet forces, battered but unbroken, began to mount a defense. The German forces had turned their attention to the city of Stalingrad, a vital industrial hub on the Volga River. Capturing Stalingrad would give the Germans control of a critical supply route, cutting off Soviet access to the rich oil fields of the Caucasus. For Stalin, the city that bore his name had to be defended at all costs. And so, Sergei's unit was ordered to the front lines of what would become one of the most infamous battles in history. Stalingrad was unlike any battlefield Sergei had ever seen. The city was already in ruins when he arrived in August 1942, reduced to rubble by the constant pounding of the German Luftwaffe. The streets were filled with debris, the buildings gutted by fire. The Volga River, which had once carried supplies and soldiers, was now a front line in itself, as Soviet troops ferried across under constant shelling. Every inch of the city was contested, and every day brought new dangers. Sergei's role as a sniper became even more critical in the hellscape of Stalingrad. The Germans had moved in with tanks and heavy artillery, but in the twisted ruins of the city, it was often the individual soldier who made the difference. Sergei would set up in the remnants of bombed-out buildings, using the rubble as cover. From his hidden positions, he watched the German infantry move through the streets, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. It was a dangerous game of cat and mouse. One mistake, and it could be over. The fighting in Stalingrad was merciless, and every day, Sergei faced death. The Soviets were outnumbered and outgunned, but their will to defend the city was unshakable. They fought house to house, room to room, often using hand-to-hand combat as the battle raged in tight quarters. The Germans, once confident of their victory, were drawn into a brutal urban war, where their tanks and planes offered little advantage. Sergei saw the toll it took on them, battle-hardened soldiers, worn down by the endless fighting, their faces hollow from hunger and exhaustion. As the harsh Russian winter set in, the battle only grew worse. The temperature plunged to -40 degrees Celsius, and both sides began to freeze in place. Food and medical supplies were scarce. The wounded often didn't survive long enough to be treated. Sergei and his comrades endured weeks of constant shelling, huddled in basements and ruined buildings for warmth. The Volga had frozen over, and the city itself seemed to groan under the weight of the cold and the death that surrounded it. For Sergei, the battle for Stalingrad had become something far beyond a military objective. It was about survival. Day after day, he fought not just to hold the line, but to stay alive. The food rations were meager, sometimes nothing more than frozen scraps of bread. Frostbite claimed the hands and feet of many soldiers. Sergei's fingers grew stiff from the cold, making it harder to grip his rifle, but he never stopped. After crossing the frozen Volga, Sergei Novikov had done what few thought possible. He had escaped the hell of Stalingrad, but the journey had taken everything from him. His strength was nearly gone, his body numb from the cold, his hands and feet scarred by frostbite. The battle for Stalingrad officially ended just days later, with the surrender of the German Sixth Army. It was a turning point in World War II, a decisive victory for the Soviet Union, and one of the bloodiest battles in history. But for Sergei, it wasn't about the victory. It was about survival. He had endured months of brutal fighting, the endless bombardments, the starvation, the bitter cold. He had seen friends die, entire units wiped out, and the city itself reduced to ashes. And now, after all that, he was alive. Once he made it to Soviet lines, Sergei was treated for his wounds and frostbite. His body was weak, but his spirit remained strong. He didn't talk much about what he had gone through. Like so many survivors of Stalingrad, he carried the memories quietly, deep inside. Sergei returned home after the war, to the small village outside Kursk where he had grown up. Life there had changed, but it was still a place of peace, far from the horrors of war. He was no hero in his eyes. He had simply done what he needed to do to survive. For the rest of his life, Sergei would remember the battle for Stalingrad,